Sounds right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of An Evening with the Philosophical Muser. This evening, we're going to talk about a very hot topic at the moment, which is the subject of racism. And I've got two guests with me, Elisa Machini and David Sulaco. So welcome, guys. Thank you for joining me. We
Hi,
may have
James.
a
Hi.
couple of others joining later if they can make it. They're on the road at the moment, so let's begin the discussion. And I would like to just introduce my guests. So if you can just say a couple of things about yourselves for the viewers. Elisa, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi, I'm Elisa. In my day job, I am an editor, and I moonlight as a local councillor. So I do a lot of, politics.
Thank you. And David?
Hi, my name's David Sulaco. I live in Birmingham.
And thank you. So David and Elisa, you really know me, I guess, from the sort of the dark world of Facebook debating forums, and you've been appreciated over the years as people I've had interesting discussions with. So I thought this might be a good one to get your views on. So I'm gonna kick off with a couple of thoughts, some of which have come from writings that I've posted recently about many of the things that have been going on in society. So I think for me, the very definition of race is problematic anyway. And I want to hear some testimonies and thoughts from yourselves about personal experience as well, because the last thing we want to do is just speak from what might be a rather privileged position of not having any sort of anecdotal stuff to bring to the table. And I think in terms of how humans define one another, I think probably the word race is already difficult. It's been used historically to define individuals according to their skin color or nationality. It's a word that has many negative connotations, of course, associated with it, about how humans treat one another. So for me, it's always been a case that there is one human race, and perhaps more preferable is the term, I would say, the human species. I consider us as one human species, all on this earth together, with all the adversities we're fighting, with all the cooperation, with everything that we've achieved together. And I know the world doesn't always behave as though that's the case, but I think what I want to perhaps do is try and break down on some of the things that people talk about when they actually talk about race. And I think people belong to different social groups. They have a common national and cultural tradition. I think, to me, ethnicity is a term that perfectly well captures what people are in terms of their heritage and their nationality, whether that's Germany, Canada, Ethiopia, wherever you come from, all of which would be under the subset. There'd be subset headings under the overarching heading of human race or human species. We know that skin color is down to genes. We know that, as far as I can tell, there isn't really a biological meaning of race which certainly justifies these kind of demarcations that we see habitually in society. I've just heard from Adam, who's going to be joining us soon. So if we're going to proceed with a discussion about racism, I think we should do so on the basis that it's a subjective concept that people use in rather abstracted sociological ways, that's not grounded in anything biological. And I think if we proceed on that basis, then the next thing to say is that to the extent that it exists or that it's perceived to exist, it seems clear that it's a learned phenomenon, that children don't seem to have any issue playing with other children of people with different skin color, for example. There's some discussion about whether they find it a bit more difficult when language is a barrier, but generally it seems to me that racism is something that's implanted by other people at certain stages in your life through your development. But having said that, there clearly is an evolutionary legacy to do with what we might call, let's say, otherness. So I know Stephen Jay Gould had an exaptation hypothesis about the things that we now call racism are traits that evolve because they serve an in-group function to aid survival by helping us to be tribally connected, and they've sort of hung around in the vestiges of our personality. So we all know that there would be a kind of selection pressure on the ability to at least understand that a different group that behaves or looks different could at some point in the past have been a threat to cooperation or a rival group. And so we all know that there's something biologically hardwired into a sense of otherness that could at some point for a lot of years have been something that we guard against or we are wary of. And I think we live in a world which has been deemed as a social contract. So we live in a relatively civilized society, particularly in the UK, and we treat each other under the conditions of those those contracts, in that it's in our mutual interest to cooperate and be mutually cooperative in a thriving society. So, by my estimation, yes, there's a lot of conflict and segregation and dislike. We've touched on where I think it possibly emerges from, and that seems quite a reasonable hypothesis based on what we know about evolution. But I would contend that there isn't really very much racism in a country like the UK if we define it in the way that most people seem to define it. I think when supposedly racist behavior happens, when it is outright hostility and aggression, it seems to me that it's largely predicated not on their skin color or even ethnicity, but some other type of otherness that's causing the conflict, the views, beliefs, attitudes, possibly the fact that there might be some kind of nationalistic agenda about immigration, but it isn't fundamentally about the fact that that person is different in terms of the way we generally define race. I don't think people are really being mean to each other because of someone else's skin color. I think skin color, religion, whatever ethnicity might be used as a pretext, but I don't. It's what it's. I think it's an outward manifestation of the kind of inner gamut of insecurity, frustration, self-regret, self-loathing, and the sort of pain and hurt that people experience manifests itself as what looks like racist behavior. I think a lot of the people who behave that way are perhaps marginalized. They feel like they haven't got as much say in society, perhaps, and it's what Evelyn Waugh called the concealed malice of the underdog, was what he called it. It's a deep inner hostility. So maybe I'll stop there for a second. I'll just invite Adam and Ricardo have joined us, which may be a good or bad time depending on how that little opening monologue went. So, do you want to give us your thoughts on that opening, Gambit? Is anything there that that you disagree with, or does that sound like the society we live in? Hi guys, welcome. Elisa.
Hello.
While
Sorry.
the guys are joining, do you wanna give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think first of all, I think you're right in trying not to, in not wanting to begin by going down the very fruitless rabbit hole of trying to discuss these things scientifically, because they are not really, you can spend about 3 hours talking about the ins and outs of the scientific definition of, what counts for, race isn't a scientific term. And therefore, you do have to discuss these issues socially, societally in that respect. That doesn't mean, that while we all agree that people's physical appearance and people's, genetic background are on a continuum, unfortunately we do see outcomes, and that's one of the other things I'm going to come on to. But in terms of whether or not you should, whether or not something is racist behavior, and whether or not you want to second guess the person who appears to be engaging in racist behavior as to trying to second guess whether they've got other problems, which they might or they might not. But if it looks like a duck and all that, I mean, it's potentially, I'm reminded of, and now I've forgotten where it comes from, but there was that scene from a book on popular science that I was reading, where there was this woman in the audience who questioned the professor about, but people didn't realize until much later that the Earth orbits the sun and not the other way around, because it doesn't look like it. And the guy responds, but what would it look like if it looked like, that is a problem, because what you're going to see is things happening differently, all other things being equal, when your skin color is different. And that is the problem that drives most of the discussions on this issue. And in terms of that, the way I prefer to talk about racism is not so much a sort of philosophical definition of what race is and what might or might not contribute to people's identity and whether or not they see themselves as being a particular race or not. It's more a societal discussion about outcomes, and whether you can find ways to rationalize the objective data that shows different outcomes, all other things being equal, depending on your skin color. And outcomes are more important to me than attitudes, although the two are, of course, related. And it's usually something that you have to, there's a lot of factors that you have to take into account, and there's rather a lot of, the worst possible thing to do is to have, when something is a hot topic and there's a lot of it about in the media and stuff, it's always very difficult to have coherent thoughts without, it becoming very heated and very, becoming interrupted and all of that kind of thing. But there is absolutely no question, I don't think, that you see disparity in outcomes for people based on skin color and background, and that is probably for me the most useful place to start.
Yeah, I think we'll probably come on to that, because I think that's an interesting one to discuss as we go on. I just want to, before I bring in David, just wanted to say hi again to Ricardo and Adam, and just summarize the initial part of the conversation, which was I was making the point that my own view is that we don't live in an overtly racist society, that race is quite hard to define biologically. I think ethnicity is better. We can talk about different aspects of people's physical appearance, like obviously skin color, but we're looking, I'm trying to look at the world as one human race and one human species, and all of the other differences, whether that's your nationality or skin color, whatever it might be, are subsets of that one human race factor. And of course, that's I'm a global citizen. I like to promote ideas that treat people along those lines. Obviously, in terms of equality, then that's another thing, because the world isn't equal in very many senses. But in terms of individuals and how equal we are on a firm footing, I think that's a good basis on which we can start. And I've also said that there are many people who perceive our society as racist, but that's mostly because they miss the likelihood that I think, you know, apparent overt discrimination is usually based on other factors, not skin color, ethnicity, etc. I think defining racism as unfairly treating people based on skin color and ethnicity, I don't think there's very much of that in this country. I think it's other factors that are being falling into the perceived narrative of racism. But let's bring in David and get your initial views.
James, here's what I think. I think the nature of racism is clear. I don't believe it's an ambiguous concept, even though, you know, we live in a world in which every concept, be it anti-Semitism or racism, has become ambiguous. And of course, if something becomes ambiguous and subjective, then no one can really be held accountable for it, particularly because that which is subjective is our opinion, or nothing but a reflection of our personal attitude and personal sentiment, which is why what racism is, that ontological question, is very important, particularly because if we don't know what racism is, or if we don't have an objective definition of what racism is, then we can't really accuse people of really and objectively being guilty of racism. So the very first question we ought to ask, particularly as we inquire into the nature of racism, is to ask the question, what is racism? We need to know. Because if we don't know what racism is, then how do you know someone's guilty of racism? And this is the problem we're facing in our society. It's the problem we face with anti-Semitism as well. We do not have a clear definition, which I believe is also indicative of the following thing. We don't have a clear understanding of what these things are. So how are we supposed to identify instances and examples of the very things we'd like to hold people accountable for? So I'm a believer of starting the inquiry with the ontological question, which obviously I alluded to before, but I'll repeat it again. What is racism? As far as I'm concerned, if we want to know what racism is, all we need to do is look back at what happened in Nazi Germany. That's a clear example of what racism is. What Hitler did to the Jews is exactly what racism is. It's about superiority that leads to racial prejudice, that also leads to racial discrimination. According to Hitler's racism, it was about an Aryan race being more superior than every other race based on genetic differences. And because of this genetic differences, bear in mind, science is not about ideologies, but people can interpret scientific data ideologically. So, for example, science shows us the following thing, that, for example, the expression, the genes for blue eyes can only be expressed if you have two blue eye genetic alleles. And if there's a gene for brown eye present, then that gene for blue eye will not be expressed. On the contrary, it will be masked because the gene for brown eyes is dominant. So what Hitler did was, oh, we understand how this works. We're going to pick this gene and we're going to impose this idea, which is not even a scientific idea, that this should represent superiority. This is the traits that we should allow in our society, particularly because it represents our idea of what it means to be superior. So Hitler was just using science to enforce an ideology that science did not really back. And as a result of this ideology, he killed 6 million Jews, particularly because he felt that the Aryan race, which was a group of people with blonde eyes and blue eyes, or with a particularly expressed genotype, were the superior ones. So that's what racism is. It's about superiority based on racial distinctions, be it eye color or the way people look. So it's not ambiguous. And I think we need to understand that, particularly because if we make an arbitrary concept, and this is what I'm afraid of, if we perceive racism as arbitrary, as something any Tom, Dick, and Harry can choose in terms of what it is, then we can never really truly hold anyone accountable. And if we do, what we've done is nothing but an expression of our personal attitude, personal sentiments, and opinions. But we can't punish people for opinions. That's not justice. So
Okay.
we need to know what racism is, particularly so, not only to, try to understand its origin and how to prevent it, but also so that we can hold people accountable, so that we can truly say, yes, this is what this person truly deserves. But if you've got an opinion, you can't do that. You can't hold people accountable on your own opinion of what something is. So we mustn't think racism is ambiguous or not clear. Otherwise, we can't do justice. We can't identify the etiology of racism or the causes of racism.
Okay.
On the contrary, all we have are ideas about it. And I don't think that works if we really and truly want to end racism in our society. We need to understand what it is.
Let me just touch on the Hitler point, because the whole point of the Hitler difficulty is, of course, that firstly, he was empirically wrong about his whole concept in the first place. I mean, there's far more genetic similarity in the German population than there would be in any African population, for example. So his ideas were wrong, and his ideas weren't factually and empirically based. And also, to go back to the initial point, I mean, Hitler is about the worst 20th century monster we can cite, but a lot of it, so much of it, is about power. It's actually probably an argument more in favor, I think, with what I was saying at the beginning, is that actually it isn't easy to define racism in those terms, because there isn't really such a thing as a biological race under which Hitler could justifiably make those distinctions. So we then have to look for other causes and other motives and other things to define.
Yeah, but James, I have to interrupt you.
Please do.
Because this is what I said earlier on, or during the time you gave me. Science does not support ideologies. That's a fact. We know that. But it can be misused and it can be interpreted ideologically. Like I said, science shows us that the allele for blue eyes is recessive, and the allele for brown eyes is dominant. So if you have two individuals, one has the recessive, one has the dominant, the blue-eyed the blue-eyed gene will not express itself. It can only express itself if both carriers are carriers of the recessive genes. That's what science shows us, period. But Hitler chose this allele. Now, this is the ideological part. I've just shown you the scientific. The ideological part is, this is the gene that should be allowed in our society. Why? Because I want this gene to represent superiority. That's ideology. Science has nothing to do with that. So of course, you're right. Science has nothing to do with ideologies. However, science can be used. It's misused in science, accepted, but it can be misused, or it can be used to propagate certain ideologies, or it can be used to disguise ideologies so they appear respectable to people.
Of course, absolutely.
You see where I'm going? So science shows us about melanin. We all share melanin. And the only reason why you're white and black is the amount of melanin that's expressed. And what determines that is our genes. Science shows us that, evolutionary speaking, that black people are black because it helped them to adapt to the environment in Africa. So, you know, it can withstand sunburn, prevent cancer, and obviously, if white people live there, white skin is not a good defense against sunburn, and that can lead to cancer, etc. So we understand skin distinctions in terms of adaptation. Sorry, that's an evolutionary idea. But to say that's what science shows us, we know what the skin does scientifically. But Hitler said, well, science says this, but I'd like to propose another idea. White implies, my white skin color implies that I'm superior. So I'm obviously illustrating the same point with different examples, but still I use genetics and I'm using skin color. And the point is simply this: science shows us one thing, but this doesn't imply that people who have selfish motives cannot abuse it or misuse it or use it to propagate ideologies or to disguise them so that they appear respectable. So what Hitler did was use science, eugenics, genetics, natural selection, Darwin's idea to propagate racism, even though Darwin, well, he might have been, I don't know, wasn't a racist. So the point is, Hitler used science to propagate racism. And racism, I'm going to repeat again, is simply the idea or the belief that one race genetic makeup makes them more superior than another race.
Okay.
That's all it is.
It's probably.
And can I just say something? Every
Okay.
scientific experiment that Hitler sanctioned or told his scientists to perform was all done to enhance the Aryan race. All the illegal experiments he performed on Jews, all the experiments, eugenic experiments, and he performed in, particularly to find out the genes that were responsible for intelligence, or the genes that made people inferior, all the recessive genes in the human genome. He wanted to get rid of it. Now,
David, can I just interrupt for a sec? I think it would be good to get off Hitler, and that's usually a good thing to do anyway. But I don't think anyone really disagrees that Hitler was wicked
he was a racist
and horrific in what he did, and morally, and I don't think anybody watching or in the panel here would disagree that Hitler was vastly and grossly mistaken about his matters of fact and his ideology.
James, was he a racist? Was Hitler a racist? Can you answer that question?
Well, this is what I'm saying at the beginning. It's too simplistic to use the term racist when I'm saying that race has a dubious definition to begin with. Hitler was a nationalist. Hitler was a tyrant. He was a totalitarian monster. He did all of the things that the worst tyrants in history have done, in excess of most of them, and he had screwed up ideologies that we all abhor.
But James, you can be a nationalist, you can be everything you mentioned, and still be a racist. I agree. Hitler was a nationalist, but he was also a racist. He had pride in the in his country. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong in being a nationalist, to be honest with you. It's good
Okay.
to be proud of your country, the good things about your country, of course. Everyone should be proud of the good things that, you know, their country has done, but we shouldn't be proud. If nationalism is about killing 6 million Jews, you should want nothing to do with it.
Okay, I'm going to move
Yeah,
on from
fine.
Hitler because I think I want to say hi to Adam, and
All right.
this is largely about racism in the UK in the 2023. So we all agreed that Hitler was bad. We've all agreed that we can probably move on from Hitler. Adam, welcome. Thanks for joining. Hello. Adam's a friend of mine, UEA student. Remind us what you're studying, Adam?
I'm doing computer science.
That's right, computer
last year.
science. Yes, computer science. Yeah. So, you've been sort of dipping in and out. I'm not sure how much you've heard so far, and Ricardo seems to have dipped in and already dipped out. So we now have the awesome foursome. I want to bring in Elisa in a minute to talk about what we've to comment on what we've talked about so far. Adam, what would you like to say?
Well, if you're asking about if I've experienced racism in my lifetime, I've been lucky / blessed to not experience any significant racism. Well, growing up in school, I wasn't the only Asian kid. I grew up in Salisbury, and that's a predominantly white area, so I was the only brown kid in the class. But luckily my classmates were absolutely lovely people, and obviously didn't make any racist comments per se. I think it's the fact that I assimilated well into the culture and behaved relatively well for a boy, a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old boy at the time. And when I moved to London, I moved to East London, so which is a predominantly ethnic minority area. So why would you experience racism per se? And yeah, those are my comments so far. Yeah.
Adam, can I ask you a question, please?
Yeah.
And the question I'd like to ask you is, how do you know you experienced racism?
How do I know if I've experienced racism?
Yes, I'd like to know that. I'm not trying to trap you here, but there's a point I'm trying to make.
If they make something, that's a good question. If they try to do something intentionally malicious because of my skin color or because of my background, I think I count that as racism. I say malicious because some people make race jokes. Obviously, comedians make race jokes all the time, and some of them are okay with it. There's this comedian Joe Coy, who's Filipino. He keeps making loads of Filipino jokes as well. And if you want to argue that's racism, people have different levels of tolerances on what jokes are offensive and what jokes are not offensive. So personally, I
was going to ask you, Adam, would you agree if your definition of racism is arbitrary or subjective? If that's the case, can you really hold someone accountable? Can you really hold someone accountable? I mean, objectively accountable. And by objective, I mean an accountability that's not determined by your feelings, your opinion. I'm talking about facts that would be the case irrespective of how you felt. Could you do that if you have an arbitrary? I'm talking about
Yeah,
facts,
no,
no opinion.
I think you can actually. It's okay. Talking about specifically if it's just racism, it would be making a comment at the expense of someone's race or doing something because of their race or their background. That's racist. Whether you choose to be offended by the racism or whether you think their intentions behind it are good or not, that's completely up to you. But the objective fact that it's racist, it's still racist. Some comedians make racist jokes. Yeah, sure, it's racist. Do you want to be offended by it? That's the subjective part.
But why would you perceive it as racist? Would you perceive it as racist because it offended you? What makes it racist? Because you were offended. Is that what
It's
makes
racist
something
because-
racist?
It's racist because of the content, but it's offensive if you are offended. So the distinction is between if it's racist, which is an inherent fact, and if it's offensive, that's what causes damage, I would say. Then that's where you draw the line. So you can make racist jokes, yeah.
Adam,
it's the offensive part that's.
I was just going to say, Adam, because we mentioned this at the beginning. So what we've been saying is that race is a fairly difficult thing to define anyway. And I believe that the things that we're mostly talking about when we say we've experienced racism are things to do with something other than actual racism, because racism is hard to define, and so is race. So skin color, ethnicity, there might be people who are, particularly hostile towards levels of immigration, and that could even, extend, of course, as it has done to Europeans. And so I think Adam is right to be fairly ambiguous about the extent to which he's experienced it, because I think it's actually quite a hard thing to define, especially as I don't think it really is a very biologically sound or even conceptually sound terminology. I think we are one human race, and I think everything largely that we use to define each other is to do with characteristics and traits that don't need the word race to describe them. I want to bring in Elisa now. You've been
Yes.
quiet for a while.
Well,
What do you think?
I went mute for some reason. Yeah, no, I think it's important in a sense, because racism is a bit of a, it's a very big umbrella thing, and it's, as I said, it's usually not productive trying and find definitions, because the important point that David is making about holding people accountable and sort of, what's illegal in this country isn't so much racism. And I say this country, but it's, in what I would assume is a normal liberal democracy, is not so much racism as discrimination. Discrimination is something you can legislate about because it's about outcomes. So, if somebody, if somebody's got, and obviously, you can go to a court of law and debate this and debate things about whether or not you were denied something like an opportunity or a salary increase or whatever, based on what we have recently come to define as protected characteristics, of which skin color is one. Ethnicity, I think, is one. And that, a court of law is not a scientific laboratory. It's not somewhere where you have sure date. Well, it's not somewhere where you can have certainty in the scientific sense, but there's such a thing as the scientific, as the legal certainty, which is not something that would satisfy a scientist, but it's how the legal order works. And discrimination is something you can prove, whereas racism is not. And that's just, whether or not somebody is a racist, is whether or not somebody believes, to believe that, to give to associate rights or worth or eligibility for things based on outward characteristics is basically the thing you wouldn't want anybody to do. And I think in terms of whether it exists, I'm pretty sure, well, I am not sure I'm ever going to agree that it doesn't, because as I said, I don't think you can ever get to the point where you can second guess everybody who's ever done anything that you might hold up as an example of something being racist. And, I think it's good that we've moved on from Hitler, but, there are sort of smaller examples of things
Hmm.
that, as I was saying before, I say smaller, but like there's a whole host of data that you can draw from based on outcomes, all other things being equal, that are different for people of different skin colors. And that's a problem. And if you've got that problem, for as long as you've got that problem, I don't think you can ever go out and say racism doesn't exist. As long as you're making a practical point. In terms of everything else, obviously, there are other things that are more or less related to this, racist jokes, actually some of them, they don't have to, they could be racist and be funny, I suppose. The question is, whether you're making the right joke in the right audience, because, if sometimes the jokes on you in that sense. And I am the first person to make a huge lot of fun about, stereotypical things about Italians. But you need to know who you're talking to, and actually, if you put your foot in it, it's genuinely, it's your problem.
Hmm.
It's not something that you can ever, I mean, you can't, sometimes you will make mistakes. And I think actually, when something goes wrong in that respect, I think people do need to be open to learning about what other people might think,
Hmm.
as opposed to, and the other thing, I'll give you an example. Sometimes you get, as I said, I'm involved in politics. I do a lot of politics, and people tend to, so you go out with things that you want to do, things you believe, and people tell you what they think. And I recently had a message from somebody who was complaining about something I was promoting or a decision I was about to make. And they said, oh, you're Italian. I don't believe you understand this country. And therefore, that's why, you're arguing for a policy that I think is wrong. And, it's not, you could argue the toss about whether that's racist or not. I'm white, but I have an accent. And, so I'm an immigrant. But, immigration is, people can be from the same, you can have a lot more in common genetically with somebody who immigrates from a long distance away, rather than, somebody who was born in the house next to you. I mean, it's not as straightforward as that. But on the one hand, does my background not influence me at all in the decision I make? Of course it does. At the same time, is that the reason why this person disagrees with me? I doubt it. And was that an appropriate comment to make? I mean, it's not something that you would necessarily, but I do actually think that that's the wrong way to think about things. And that's the wrong way, it's not. And it does go back to using something that doesn't actually have anything to do with what you're talking about.
Yes.
And does that mean that racism doesn't exist? No, I think it does. It does exist. Although you can't second guess the person. Do they actually believe that the reason they disagree with me is I'm Italian? Or are they just fishing around for stuff that sounds? I mean, I've absolutely no idea, and you can't second guess this person. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that they made a racist comment. Is that because, why did they do that? Or whether they have a deep-seated insecurity, they're worried about something, or they just don't know how to articulate what they're thinking. It just came to mind. And why did it come to mind? And didn't something else come to mind, such as, I think you've got the wrong data, or I think you're looking at the wrong things, But, I do think that you kind of have to come to terms with the fact that some comments are objectively drawing on somebody's background and therefore ought to be recognized for what they are.
I want to ask you a political question in a second. So brace yourself. Before I do, because I think you've touched on something that we hopefully would move on to anyway, which is the sort of false imputation as well. So if we can just summarize up to this point, I think what I'm trying to drive at is, yes, I agree that I wouldn't go so far as to say there's no racism in this country, of course. I'm trying to define a racist action or a racist accusation or whatever it might be, as, if we are going to define it, would be the thing that's left when all of the other motivations have been precluded. Now, I don't think we can do that because I think they're complex. And I think in your case is a great example. Does that critic really care that you're Italian? Well, it's a bit of a low blow, isn't it? But fundamentally, what they care about is, first off, in the primary sense, is that you have, in their view, you have advocated something that they disagree with, and the fact that you're Italian is an easy low blow to make, and that may feed into something about they may have different views on immigration, which of course isn't personal to you, and they may just be an out-and-out bigot who wants to, you know, get you where it hurts. But I think in order to define racism as we are doing, to me, it's going to be the stuff that's left when we've ruled out the other much more likely things, because, and also including that, of course, would be the very primary thing that people just aren't often very nice when they feel threatened, or when they feel aggrieved, or when they feel like there's a division in political view or ideology. And so I wanted to ask you a particular political question. I haven't got the stats to hand, but I remember blogging about this. It was to do with the extent to which the police were accused of being racist or not racist. Now, I recall doing the sums at the time, and it was about the number of black people that were being stopped and searched, okay? And I recall that at the time, the headlines were that the police must be racist because they're disproportionately searching young black men. And of course, they're still stopping and searching white young men. But it turned out, with a simple bit of research, I think we probably all know this, that black young men were committing disproportionately a larger number of the crimes, particularly the crimes that would elicit a kind of a stop and search routine, and that actually, if you removed that factor, they were actually being stopped and searched disproportionately less than they should have been relative to the disproportionality of the crime. Now, obviously, nobody's saying that we shouldn't be stopping and searching white young men. Nobody is saying that there isn't some degree of discrimination in the police force, but that was a very good example. And I remember using an illustration of an island population to show that actually, if you get the calculations right, something can look on the surface like negative discrimination in one aspect, but actually they are negatively discriminating against the minority group, which in this case was the white group, purely on numbers. And of course, let's also remember that in stopping and searching young black men in the cases that they were doing, remember that they're also discriminating against vast swathes of the population, because statistically they're less likely to be carrying knives, for example, anyway. So, and I use the example of Muslims in airports, that particularly in what seemed like the peak of Islamic terrorism and what have you, that Muslims were being disproportionately stopped and searched at airports, but then the majority of people who are likely to have any explosive device at airports were likely to be Muslim. So my point was then that you don't just randomly search members of the population in a entirely unchosen fashion, because what's the point of that? You're looking to target people who are statistically more likely to be criminals. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that all young black men are more likely to be criminals. It simply means that disproportionately they were stopped and searched more because of the statistics. And of course, what actually happened was that the police were told you can't even be seen to be doing this anymore, even though statistically it's in it's the right kind of ratio. You just need to stop this. So, Elise, I wanted to ask you from a political perspective what you probably thought about that case, because you must know it quite well in your political remit.
Now, of course, I've heard quite a lot about this, and it's actually a little complicated because so stop and search has a long and illustrious, sarcastically speaking, history in the sense that, I mean, there's probably, I mean, in terms of if you were asking me, sorry, if you were asking me, you know, in terms of what ways in which the police might or might not chance upon criminals when they don't know anything else. I mean, stop and search is pretty much the, yeah. In whichever way you look at it, I do think statistically it doesn't hold any kind of water, because you can't put a human being, regardless of who they are, trained policeman, young policeman. If you put me in the middle of a busy street and you ask me, do stop and search for 2 hours, there's no way at all. If I try, if I don't try, there's no way at all that I can be truly random in my selections. No way at all.
Exactly.
Nobody can be. Nobody can be. So there's always going to be a bias, whether it's conscious, unconscious, and actually whether in a particular area you get searched less or more. I mean, it's in terms of, I mean, when you're, which relates actually to the thing that I was saying earlier, you know, why did that person say to me, oh, you're Italian, therefore you don't you don't know about politics or policy, or that's not, you don't have the correct opinion or something like that. I mean, if I had been, you know, it's kind of interesting if you think about the various permutations. I mean, if I had been a black woman from Essex, what would he have said? If I had been, you know, white British of purest degree from I don't know, King Canute, who himself wasn't British, you know, what would he have said? If I had been, you know, if I'd been an immigrant from Australia or from Canada or from the US, what would he have said? I mean, there is this way, you know, he disagrees with what I'm saying and is trying to find a way to other me, other than saying he disagrees. And you know, and that is racism, because, you know, if you're going to use something other than my opinions to say that you disagree with me, then that, you know, if you happen to use ethnicity, then you're racist. You know, you might say, oh, you know, I know that you like, I don't know, you have a taste for, I don't know, pasta, and I hate pasta, and therefore you're wrong about something else. I mean, that's a known sort of fallacy. But, you know, people don't tend to say, oh, I know that you like pasta, and therefore you're wrong about politics. But they do tend to say, you're not from this country, or you don't have the right skin color, and therefore, and that. In terms of the statistics about crime, I mean, I think one of the worst possible things about stop and search is that you're trying to make a statistical tool out of people, and people will not be statistical tools. And the other thing, of course, is that if there is a correlation, and that's something that goes back to the point I was making earlier about outcomes, there is going to be, if you look for it, it's been found time and again that there is a statistical correlation between your ethnicity and the chance that you might be a criminal, or the chance that you might be, because basically, you know, it goes through deprivation, it goes through income, it goes through all of these things, and, you know, you end up, you're much more likely to go down a bad path in life if you're much more likely to grow up in poverty, if you're much more likely to have less opportunity in life, and all these things have to feed into whether, you know, you can ever have a profile for somebody who is statistically more likely to be a killer or a criminal based purely of them walking down the street. And that's basically the problem with that. And I happen to work I've worked with 2 policemen who were ex-policemen, and I worked with them quite closely, so we talked about this quite a lot. And they both said to me the same thing, which is one of the reasons why the police always ends up in trouble when it comes to sort of having racist practices or racism, institutional racism in them, is the fact that it's an institution that works on the basis of personal culture. You're a young policeman, you go in, you get paired with somebody who's old and experienced, and they guide you, they talk to you, they sit in a car with you for hours and hours every day. And you learn all that you need to learn like that.
Mm.
And that fosters a continuity in culture that is quite difficult to change. And that actually, when consensus out there on how you actually more effectively achieve what you want to achieve is evolving, that's the kind of institution that will adapt more. Will find it more difficult to adapt.
Mm.
And that, I think, is one of the problems and one of the reasons why they can't get out of this vicious circle of having racist practices in itself that get exposed. And why the Met is always, unfortunately they are institutionally quite unlikely to be able to make the kind of change that they need to make. And that is a political problem. But it's not the kind of intervention that is easy to do politically at the same time, because it's nothing ever works as well as you think it will for top-down sort of intervention. So you kind of have to support the kind of institutional evolution that is usually because it's usually driven by other factors. But the police aren't a business. They aren't, they don't have the sort of external and they have to achieve objectives, but you can't dissolve them if they don't. So it's a problem.
I think that's actually an interesting segue, I think, into something that's broadly happening in society. I mean, Adam might have a particularly good standpoint on this from the university perspective, is that I think we all agree, surely, that equality of opportunity is a good thing. We want everyone to be as equal as possible in terms of opportunity to thrive and fulfill their potential. There's a kind of fabricated equality which is being pushed on society in terms of equality of outcome. And what's interesting, I think, is that as we begin to erode away, or try, as people start to try to erode away what are actually important differences between people, and you mentioned some of them, Elisa, then what's left is this kind of vacuum where things like perceived unfair discrimination are coming to the fore. So, for example, we live in a society now where a lot of people are trying to deny the biological distinction between the sexes. They're trying to erode away the concept of competence-based achievements. The refusal to believe that IQ makes any significant difference to success. The denial about the fact that many of the reasons for our struggles are due to our own bad decision making, and the difference between men and women are socio-culturally determined, and things like that. And there are groups of people who are having more and more of an influence, I think, who are looking to seek attention, and I think find some meaning in their own lives. I think they call it social justice and wokeism and all sorts of things that are under those complex umbrellas. Where if you then depart from that kind of thinking, it's then easy for them to want to play cards like racism and sexism and what have you, and that. I mean, Adam, is this something you're picking up on in the universities, and are you inhibited somewhat in what you feel you can say in an environment like the UEA at the moment, do you think?
Well, I'm pretty sure that what you described is going on behind the scenes. From my perspective, in the classroom, it's not exactly obvious. The lecture, it's not going to be overt to the student to the average student that this sort of what was that term? Affirmative action it's not, it doesn't manifest itself in a very obvious way. So, and in terms of how the lecturers treat us, they treat us based on luckily for us, they treat us based on objective work. So they treat us, they give you grades based on how well you've done, and it's difficult for me to determine if they've actually marked something based on race or what other factors. But what's interesting is that in my classrooms, at least, I don't know why they're still complaining about racism, yet the vast majority of the students I'm with are usually people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and yet the university is still complaining that it's racist. This could just be my class, and one class is obviously not representative of the whole university, but I don't know why. Yeah, why would you scream racism if it's obviously not there? As in, the numbers definitely do not indicate that this is a university that bans certain races straight out, because they don't. And
If I may
that
interject
fills me right
very,
out.
very briefly, I do think it depends. It depends what they're saying. You would have to see exactly what they're saying, because while your university or some courses or some classes or whatever, I don't know, but academia in itself has a problem with equality of attainment,
Mm.
and it's better now than it used to be, but because academia very much has been dominated by, I suppose, the Western universities for so long. So there is an abundance of white men professors from, I suppose, Europe and America, and that's kind of been diluted, but only very recently. And another one of the problems with academia is sort of the professional advancement of people. I mean, it's a very male-dominated environment, because quite honestly, the kind of things they want you to do, the kind of movement that you're expected to have, the kind of professional flexibility that you're expected to have if you're going to achieve, you have to survive for a long time on very precarious before you can actually, and all of a sudden you sort of become, you get, I suppose in America they call it tenure, or you become wealthier and happier, but you need to wait a long time, and that's easier to do if you can rely on somebody else for childcare. So there are those problems which wouldn't necessarily be related to the number of people in a class and their background, although what you've described is a sign that actually academia is evolving, just taking quite a long time.
David, I want to bring you in a second and ask you a question about something in particular. But I think to touch on Adam's point, this is something that's on my mind as well, is that you ask, well, why would people perhaps cry racism, and what would their motivations be? I think this is another factor that we're seeing that's quite widespread in society. You may remember recently, it's an infamous case with Ngozi Fulani and Lady Susan Hussey. Now, this is in a blog post of mine a while back. I coined the term racial grifter, and it isn't just applying to race. So a grifter is basically someone who uses sort of con artist tricks to further their own cause. So environmentalists might be grifters for climate alarmism. Jeremy Corbyn was a grifter for socialism and that sort of thing. And I think Ngozi Fulani, if you saw how she responded to that conversation, and Lady Susan Hussey was clumsy in her wording, of course, but there's no question in my mind that that lady used that to her advantage to try to peddle a narrative about racism when it isn't intended. And I go back to the point earlier that, one way to look at society is to say that, well, if we're pulling statues down, demanding the removal of statues on the grounds of historical racism, then to me, that some people might say, well, we must be in the throes of racism if we're doing that. But actually, it says to me that there's not an awful lot wrong with the society in terms of its racist outlook, or so-called racist outlook, if we're now focusing our attention on statues from figures of 100 and 200 years ago. Now, I'm not saying that means there's no racism, obviously, but David, we know that there are many people out there who are using racism, the putative racism, for their own gains and their own motivations, and this sort of moves into the area of snowflakery and the offense culture as well. Somebody like Diane Abbott might get some horrific abuse on Twitter, but it's largely, I think, people like that. It's largely because of who they are and what they believe. And yes, they may be using language which is entirely inappropriate, but there are going to be lots of very respected people out there who aren't getting that kind of racist abuse. Yasmin El-Abaya-Brown gets a lot of racial abuse. Afua Hirsch, Kerry Ann Mendoza, people like that. They're people that frustrate society with very extreme political views. They get offended very easily. They're also quick to dish it out. I mean, Diane Abbott has made comments that are, racist in reverse, if you like, talking about white people. So has Yasmin El-Abaya-Brown. Where very little's been made of it. They're quite divisive characters. So when people are crying racism, and it's evidently linked to a whole host of other factors, we have to call that out as well, and we have to say that there is a lot of racial grifting that occurs in society. And one final point I'll make before I hand over to David. I've been to quite a few events, because it's easy for a big, 6'7" white English guy to say, yeah, we're all making too much of a thing about racism. You might say, well, it's easy for you, you're one of the least likely people to be the victim of that kind of thing. And I accept that, and I accept that if you are a minority in this country in terms of anything, where you are in a minority in a group, then you do feel it. I've been to a church in Manchester when I was the only white person in there, and I loved it, and it was great. I didn't feel particularly uncomfortable, but I was aware I was the only white person. They made me feel very welcome, and it was a great event. But I've been to a lot of those Black History Month events, and the thing that really came home to me from attending those events was, here's me going there, really integrating and wanting to get to know people, and not in the least worried about skin color, although I was obviously by far in the minority of white people there. But it was the preoccupation with skin color and what they would call race and racism, and it was the refusal to move past some of the historical wrongs that have happened in society. And part of my contention, which has brought to bear on on this discussion is that unless we start to treat each other in ways that look at the individual identity and look beyond skin color and beyond ethnicity and beyond those kind of former prejudices, and have a sense of oneness, have a sense of the human species as a whole is collective. It's, in a sense, it's in it together in the grander sense of the, against nature, against all the other different things we have to cooperate to, problems to solve. And it seemed to me that there was a distinct preoccupation in those groups and in others like it, like there is with the climate groups in climate alarmism, of just not being able to move past that. So probably a good time to hand over to David. There's quite a lot said there, but and I'm aware you haven't spoken for a while. So yeah, let's hand over to you, David. You're on mute, buddy. You're on mute. Let's unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Oh, where did I go? I've always been here, you know. I was just going to agree with Mark in terms of what he said earlier on. It's Mark, isn't it? Am I correct? The other guy.
Adam.
Oh, sorry, Adam. My bad. Sorry, Adam. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Adam said. I agree with him in terms of what he said about people throwing around you know, racism and attributing everything to racism when there's probably no racism involved in certain situations. In other words, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in our society, particularly in the media, because I think they're the biggest propagators of this false racism narrative. You know, they're so quick to attribute racism to everything. Like, for example, that incident between, what's her name again, Lady Hussey and Ngozi. They immediately attributed that to racism when it could have just been about misunderstanding, ignorance. There are a variety of different possibility or possible explanation, you know, we can attribute to various situations, but they are bent on attributing everything to racism. I think that has to stop because it's divisive. You know, it creates mistrust. It can damage race relation, and there's no need for that. Because if we divide our society with false narratives, then we're going to end our own society. And I don't think anyone wants to end their own society. At least I don't believe anyone in their right mind wants to do that. So I think we have to be more responsible with the way we perceive things and the sort of language, you know, we choose to use to describe our experiences, particularly because if we misuse our language, it can have it can cost us in a variety of different ways. And I don't think we want to live in a society where, you know, races are against each other based on a false narrative. But I'm also happy that there's been reconciliation between Lady Hussey and Ngozi. And well, there appears to be a reconciliation. And I think the media needs to start promoting that more than, you know, their preoccupation with race. It's just too much. You know, it's just too much. And I think the reason why they do it is because that's what people are interested in. They're interested in division, because if they weren't, if people frowned against that, they'd probably not propagate it. But because their ratings keep increasing whenever they propagate stuff like that, it encourages them to continue. That's what happens, you see. So, but it's not, I think we should put our society's best interest above ratings, above division, Instead we should promote unity and good and healthy race relation. And I
Mm.
don't think the media are doing that enough.
No.
So I don't really believe every situation or every conflict between, for example, an Asian or black or white necessarily has to do with racism. I don't believe any, all conflicts between Jews or whites necessarily has to be about anti-Semitism, but the media seems to promote antithesis. Whenever there's something between, a Jew or, for example, a German, it's anti-Semitism, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, when we're now living in a society, in which it's even difficult to criticize people. Because if I criticize people, and even if my criticism of that person is valid, they immediately attribute racism to it. But it doesn't necessarily, if I call someone stupid, that doesn't mean I'm racist. It could be because he did something stupid.
Yeah, well, this goes back to the Diane Abbott thing. This is exactly what we're saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't,
Yeah.
Carry on, James. Carry on.
Yeah, exactly. And you notice what happened with the Royals as soon as that incident kicked off. They went straight down on the side of racism, and they basically, as initially, threw Lady Hussey under a bus, metaphorically. I think, as you say, there's been some reconciliation now, because you've seen what's happened with Meghan Markle and Harry, the claims of racism against the royal family largely hasn't been very well received by most people. And Meghan, whatever you think about her, has developed a bit of a complex, and she's been subject to the opprobrium of the masses. And I think there's a famous fable in Aesop's Fables, one of the great books to read as a child. We all know The Boy Who Cried Wolf. If people keep crying racism when there is none, then two things happen. The first thing is they get disliked pretty quickly because nobody wants to see the term racism or bigotry or whatever it might be abused. And the other thing is it detracts from the other causes and the other reasons why people are responding to them in a certain way. I don't think anybody, almost nobody, is racist towards, say, Meghan Markle. I think people have genuinely taken a dislike to her because of her conduct, and there are all sorts of reasons why that might be true, and so, there may even be some questions about whether she's told the truth in a number of areas. I'm not sure what the validity of those claims are, but clearly there's been a big reaction, and I think we're doomed to keep repeating this stuff if we keep focusing on putative terms of race, when actually society needs to wise up a bit and understand that there are differences, there are conflicts, there are distinctions, and a lot of them are very valid because they're competence based, and we judge quite well on competence, I think, generally. And we're a deeply connected society now. And
can I just add something, James?
Yeah,
Sorry to
please do.
interrupt. You're speaking about competence, and that reminded me of one of the Euro 2020 final when Bukayo Saka missed the penalty against Italy. Absolutely
I was very
heartbreaking.
happy about that.
That's such a you're such a racist, Elisa. That's outrageous.
Yeah, but the storm on social media, of course, there was racism after Saka missed that penalty, saying about his skin color, etc. But usually, normally from a there's rational criticism of what happened. Like, it's not just people aren't just angry at him because he's black. It's because he missed the penalty, and that led us to, of course, it didn't come home, and it was definitely a competence problem, and there are people saying that Southgate
Yeah.
shouldn't have put Saka onto the team. Like, I mean, that is a valid criticism, simply because not because of racism, but because
Hmm.
Saka was only 19, and you don't want 19-year-old. You don't want to put the pressure of a final penalty, the one that makes you win or lose, onto a 19-year-old, especially in the football industry. So there was definitely a competence argument for that. While the racism stuff is the one that took flight in social media, especially. There was support for the three lions, which was Sterling, Rashford, and Saka, and there was the public came out in droves for support for them, but the racism bit was a bit overhyped in my opinion.
I mean, it
About that
might
incident.
have been overhyped, but one of the problems is that, some of the stuff I've seen, and that is, you could probably solve 3/4 of the world's problems if you just abolished social media at all. Which, given how James and I met, it's probably, but I swear to God, I mean, it wasn't like that 10 years ago. It really wasn't. Probably because it just, it hadn't, these things do tend to take a life of their own. But there was quite a lot of stuff, if you're going to, I mean, I don't know. I suppose if he'd been white and missed the penalty, he would have had a lot of, you twat, you idiot, you incompetent, all of that kind of stuff. I don't think he would have had some of the other stuff, such as, you monkey, or you go back to where you came from, that sort of thing. And of course, these things get amplified. But, I mean, the bloke was, in a under pressure situation and he screwed up. I mean, I suppose that's completely and totally human.
Absolutely.
But,
yeah.
it's, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you can overhype these things, but you can also over justify them, just because there's a few of them that get over amplified over Twitter. But quite a lot of people have seen it. Even I have seen it. I'm not much of a football person. I was watching because Italy was playing. But, Roberto Baggio famously, somebody who wasn't 19, in 1994, I was 12, but I still remember that, he shot a penalty to the moon. The guy was, white, Italian, and celebrated, very massive, massively well-known footballer, and he missed in a very awful way because it happens. And, if that had happened these days, I mean, what kind of insults would he have had? Twitter didn't exist in 94. But you kind of have to worry about these things because, I don't think that you can just, you could try and go into the motivations of these people. I mean, these are angry football fans. I mean, why do they use those terms when they could say other things? And why does it matter that they say monkey rather than idiot, or which, to be honest, if you look at the etymology, actually, idiot is no less offensive, because of who it makes. But, overusage will get you desensitized to those things. And it's actually, I had a very interesting discussion at one point, the culture of insults and where all these words come from. And they all come from specific parts of society that you were making fun of, and it's something that we humans do. But it doesn't mean that everyone gets a free pass to be insulting in any whatever way, even if they're justified in being angry. It's, if you're an adult, you're gonna have to, you're gonna have to consider your words, especially if you're putting them on a platform that would be read by millions, and which goes back to the lady, whatever her name was, because, when you're a civil, I'm not quite as well known as she is, but when I go to event in my capacity as a councillor, everything you do is on the record, everything you say is on the record. These days, everyone's got a bloody thing, and, that's recording you or recording something else, and you happen to be in it. And, the kind of thing that Gordon Brown ended up in trouble with when he got recorded saying that somebody was a bigot because they forgot to turn the mic off. I mean, you don't get away with that kind of thing anymore. You know, you have to be careful what you say.
But that's a curious thing,
Or-
isn't it? Because I remember that, and I'm not a big fan of Gordon Brown, but I was on his side because yes, he got caught, but the woman was being bigoted, and he was the one who got more criticism really than perhaps
Yeah, of course.
he
and
should have.
that's- And that's because you should, you know, it's part of the thing. It will happen, so you have to factor it in. And you know, because they talked so much about this thing with Ngozi Fulani and Baroness, I keep forgetting. And it's not
Susan
somebody
Huss,
I know
yeah.
from the royal family, and therefore I can't remember her name. But you know, I went and looked at I mean, there is a transcript which basically means that somebody was there with a recording device, despite the fact that this was like a party, a mingling, meet and Greek event or something like that.
Very convenient, wasn't it? Having a
Well,
you know, very
if you're
convenient.
full of celebrities, I'm guessing that sort of thing will happen. But if you read it, which I hated myself for doing, but I did, I mean, you know, there are, you know, you sort of have to wonder whether, you know, at some point there is quite a lot of justification for Ngozi Fulani to have felt really rather hurt, because it didn't stop at, you know, where are you from? And she says, I'm from Sister Power, I think the name is, of the charity that she works for. And then, you know, and then you go, where are you from? I'm from Sister Power. But where are you from? Oh, we're based in Hackney. No, but where are you actually from? And she's like, I'm from London. No, but where are your people from? And she's like, well, I don't know. And she says, well, which part of Africa are you from? And she goes, I don't actually know, because there aren't any records. I mean, it's quite a long time before she starts getting worked up. And then, no, but where are your people actually from? And it's entirely clear that Lady Royal Lady, whose name I keep forgetting,
Susan Hussey.
she clearly saw the skin color or attire. I don't know what, you know, one has to assume it was the skin color that made her wonder. And she was determined that she was going to know where this person was from. The problem is, from the other person's perspective, you know, it's, you don't necessarily like being questioned to that extent. I mean, there is Lady Susan, what is that her name? Lady
Susan
Lady
Hussey.
Susan doesn't, you know, it's not a human right to know
Hang
your
on a minute,
answer, you know, but it's,
wait,
you
hang
know,
on.
if I want to know where you're from and you're not comfortable saying that, you know, I don't have a God-given right to find out. You know, it's up to you whether you tell me or not.
But you know that if somebody was being asked that by Lady Susan Hussey, who didn't have an agenda and who wasn't being deliberately triggered, you know that you would take the conversation in context and you would understand that maybe this woman's from a different generation. Maybe she's not asking the questions very well. Maybe she's being clumsy with her wording. Maybe she even is a bit unused to the kind of questioning that, you know, you only have to go back a few generations to find, you know, all our ancestors are European and then 100 or so Asia and a few hundred more Africa. So it's clumsy wording, but I think what you said a moment ago was interesting about language, because and then couple that with social media, and we have created quite a storm with what we've done to humanity. I remember reading a discussion about the sitcom Porridge recently. Ronnie Barker was making the point, for those who don't know, Porridge is a classic 70s sitcom written by Dick LeClement and Ian LaFreni, I think their names are. Brilliant comedy. Ronnie Barker's the figurehead. It's a fantastic sitcom. And they were saying when they were preparing for it that, you know, how are we going to get away with the fact that in prison there's going to be lots of swearing, and we need some kind of pejorative term to insult each other with. So they ended up writing the term naff off. Now, obviously, everyone knows what naff off really means, but it was shown on, you know, For the Watershed. It was a popular sitcom, and they managed to choose words that weren't offensive, but everyone knew what they meant. Now, had they replaced them with a more harsh expletive, it would have been an entirely different conversation. And to return to something earlier, which is, you talked about the penalty miss, and some of the abuse that guy got was horrific, and it was on places like Twitter, I think, wasn't it? We still have to comment on the fact that people were choosing. They were angry. They were upset that the team was out of the World Cup. They wanted someone to be angry at, and they were still choosing to use the fact that that guy is black as a way of trying to insult him. Now, I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier, that firstly, most people...
But did they though?
Well, let me just finish. Most people in society, thankfully, aren't like that. I have enough confidence in people to know that whether it's through their own human decency or whether it's part of a good family background coupled with the social contract, most people aren't going to be doing that. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because what social media does, it creates the kind of environment where the people I talked about earlier, who have the concealed malice of the underdog, people who are, really bitter inside, and we've all come across characters like that, and we've all read about characters like that, who, for all sorts of reasons, are internally damaged and broken and unable to contribute to society in the way they want to. They probably, many cases, can't have the kind of relationships they want. They may be what they call them incels, involuntary celibates. That makes up a proportion of society where it's been unleashed on society through social media. Look at any Guardian column or any YouTube video, hopefully not this one, and see some of the hate and the vitriol that's coming out of people, often anonymous people with avatars, and that's not how we generally behave to each other in society anyway. But this anonymity and this hiding behind a keyboard and this going straight for the jugular is, I think, exacerbated by the fact that people can do it facelessly through social media. Now, I'm a big fan of social media and the internet in general. I think it's done an amazing amount of good for human knowledge and connectivity, and I've met you fine people through social media too. But I don't think we can deny the fact that the sort of behavior we're talking about, the people who are likely to take to Twitter and be that unkind towards the footballer, what's his name? Saka, is it? You said?
Yeah, Bukayo Saka.
Yeah, Saka. And it's because the problem is there were these 3 blokes who missed, and they were all black.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
I mean, yeah, because basically I'm trying to remember, because there's 5 penalties, and the 3 of them missed. Harry Kane didn't miss, and I can't remember for the life of me who the last one was. But if you're going to be angry about football, because arguably it was a pretty good way to lose. You couldn't have lost any. As far as one team has to lose and one team has to win the cup. I mean, they got as far as they were going to. They played really well. But people are angry and are upset, and they don't think about it in those terms. They just have feelings that they want to let out. Now, the question is, it's human nature that you will potentially want or feel an instinct for being as nasty as possible when you feel like that. But there are things you will go for that I don't think you can condone.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Because as I said, if you're going to say something about somebody, that's the last bastion. I mean, you can't defend yourself from that.
No.
And you can't argue, and that's arguably, these people don't want a conversation. If they wanted a bloody conversation, I don't think that's what they would do. But if somebody does want a conversation, they also do need to be open to the other side, and that's what I think everybody has to learn. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter who you are, how old you are, what your job is. you have to listen to the other side. And if the other side tells you that they're hurt and that they think you're being racist, it's usually a good idea to think about it, because we do live in a world where you will become entrenched. It's very easy to just retreat into your respective camps.
Yeah.
That is really not going to help anything.
No, I think we're all on the same page with that. There's a great line from Graham Greene. He says, hate is the hate is the failure of imagination. And I think
James, hold on.
I think somebody's beating down his door.
I know. Let's hope he's safe. We don't want to see a live attack on.
God, no.
Might help with the viewing figures, but
Yeah, well,
But-
they're really rough down there in Birmingham.
oh, I
aren't
know. It's I've driven through it at speed. It's but no, the thing is that sense of otherness we've mentioned, but really the way forward, I think, is the more you understand people, the more we understand each other, the more we see the similarities, the more we see the more we see how alike we are in way more ways than we're not alike. Part of the thing for me is it would be fantastic if we move beyond these preoccupations as best.
Sorry,
we
guys.
can. Okay, we're just about to close in a sec. I think,
Oh, okay.
but yeah, we're just saying, David. You know, surely the narrative and surely the message from discussions like this and beyond is, despite a difference in skin color, ethnicity, things that we can't control. We can control our religious beliefs. We can control our politics. But we can't control our height and our eye color and all this sort of stuff. And there's hate is a failure of the imagination. It's not understanding just how alike we all are. There's obviously less unfair discrimination when we become more integrated. There's less racial violence. There's less of the things that we want to eradicate. So I'm mindful of the time. It's been a really good discussion, and thank you for joining. Anybody with any final burning comments? I don't want to leave anyone short if they're bursting with something to say, but it's been a really good discussion, and thank you for joining. Does anyone want to have a closing comment, or?
No, I'm just gonna say thank you guys for the conversation. So I enjoyed it as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Adam, Lisa.
Stay off Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter.
I
That's good.
completely agree, and I'm never going on it.
That's good advice. It's
But
too
I
succinct
do-
for me. I can't say my piece as you know, in a few words. Okay, really good discussion. Thank you, guys. I'm so
Thank
grateful
you.
that you participated.
Thank
It's been
you.
really interesting. And yeah,
Cheers.
thank you, guys. Bless you.
Bye.
Thanks.